Now that you understand what you need to eat in order to tame type 1 diabetes, let's talk about the how. Because once you know what to eat, there's a certain technique to how you eat that's going to help you tame your type 1 and control your blood sugars even better. And it all is about consistency. You need to be consistent with your meals. Consistency is so important, and without it, every single meal and every single dose is a bit of a guessing game. Have you ever noticed that from one meal to the next, you use the same calculations you did before? You count your carbs, you count your protein, you count your fat, you take your insulin, you use the same calculation you did for the previous meal, but it ends up at being an unexpected high or an unexpected low. Maybe less either way now since you're going low carb, but you end up with an unexpected result. Why is that? Why isn't that predictable? Because you're not being consistent. Right now, you might be just eating whatever, whenever. You don't plan what you eat. You only think about what you're eating when it's time to eat. You ask yourself, your girl, your boy, hey, what do you want to eat? I don't know. And you go from there. You have no idea what you're eating from one meal to the next until the time comes. And you might also think, variety is the spice of life. Because after all, if your meals are the same all the time, then isn't that just so boring? Isn't it much more fun when your meals are different every single meal, every single day? I used to think that too. That variety is the spice of life. But unfortunately, that mindset, and yes, it is a mindset, just doesn't work so well for type 1 diabetes because you don't have consistency. In order to find out what insulin dose works for what food, you need to treat every single meal like an experiment. But if your fat's all different, if your carbs are different, if your protein's all different, if you're eating variety all the time every day and not keeping anything consistent, how are you supposed to ever experiment and figure that out? There's simply too many confounding variables. Now, there's always variables you can't deal with, like stress, hormones, the weather, that will spike your blood sugar, bring it down, or make you more or less insulin resistant. But the one thing you can control is what you eat. And if you keep that consistent, then that lowers the variability a ton. And when you get rid of those confounding variables, it'll make a huge difference. Let's say, for example, you have wings for dinner one night, you bolus, and you end up spiking a little bit too high. And the next night, you decide to have steak and a salad. Are you going to be able to take the information from yesterday's bolus with a different food, with less fat, with more protein, with less greens, and be able to properly apply it to the food you're having today? You're not, because they're not consistent. Instead, if you had those dinners be the same, or at the very least have the same carbs and protein, you'd be able to take the information from the day before. Let's say you bolus, you end up a little bit too high. And you'd be able to apply that to the next day. You decide to take a little bit more insulin. You'd be able to learn from your previous meals on your previous days if you go too high, if you go too low, if you get it just right. And you'll be able to experiment with less confounding variables until you get the bolus just right. Because it's very rare that we get the bolus just right on the very first try. But if you give yourself multiple tries by eating consistent meals, then you give yourself a fighting chance to truly find better blood sugars and find that flat line. That's why it's so important to eat consistency. When you have consistency, you have less variables. When you have less variables, you have predictability. And when you have predictability, you have better blood sugars. You see what I'm saying? Now, I know consistency might sound daunting, but it's actually not hard at all. And there's many ways you can go about it, being less various or more various, depending on your preferred style. Follow me along to the next video where I'll explain consistency further and how you can get started and how you can find better, more predictable blood sugars by turning every meal into a constant, consistent experiment.